Students, I want to make two supplementary remarks for the Reagan lecture. First of all, the Soviet Union shot down a Korean Airlines passenger jet that had actually many Americans on it. This was in 1983. One of the many Americans on that passenger flight was a member of the U.S. Congress. The Soviets could see with radar that the aircraft had violated Soviet airspace. It was an accident on the part of the pilots, but the fact is U.S. intelligence sent spy flights along Soviet borders, and apparently Soviet military and governmental leaders thought that this was a purposeful intrusion by the U.S. with a jet. They should have known better. If they'd looked at their own evidence better, they would have understood that this was a passenger jet. But they shot it down. Hundreds died, lots of Americans, lots of South Koreans, and some others. Reagan, who was convinced of the evils of the Soviet Union, which he called the evil empire, used this to tremendous propaganda effect. NSA was able to it captured, which it automatically did, Soviet communications. These were provided to the president. He played some of these recordings in a speech to the U.S. Citizenry. His ambassador to the UN played some of these recordings captured by NSA at a speech to the UN. Reagan apparently was convinced that the Soviets had done this on purpose. Anyway, it was a huge issue, and it really did make the Soviet Union look very bad. That was in Reagan's first term. The other topic, big topic, which I did not speak about before, was U.S. and Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. I talked about that with regard to the Carter era, and I said it would get much bigger in the Reagan era. So what about that? Remember, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan out of frustration with Afghan governments that were not sufficiently pro-Soviet. This occurred with about a year to go in Carter's presidency. Carter authorized first non-lethal and then lethal aid to the Mujahideen, the people in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet occupiers. This helped to begin to turn the tide against the Soviet Union and the pro-Soviet government there. The Soviets had thousands of troops, many thousands, in Afghanistan. When Reagan came into office, he substantially upgraded that program. By the end of his presidency, the Soviets basically faced defeat and ultimately withdrew from Afghanistan. Thousands of Soviet soldiers had died. Now, the way that the U.S. provided aid to the Mujahideen, in retrospect, was probably a very bad way. We routed that aid through the government of Pakistan, which then passed on this, guns, weaponry, other aids and supplies to Afghan groups that were aligned with the Pakistani government. Again, the Soviets were defeated. There's a movie called Charlie Wilson's War about a Congressman Wilson from Texas, and he was important in this whole process. It wasn't just Reagan himself. But the aftermath, so in the short term, the Soviets were defeated in Afghanistan. They withdrew. It was considered to be their Vietnam, in a sense. But beyond that, some of the weaponry, for example, those Stinger missiles, hand or shoulder-held missiles that could be launched against Soviet helicopters. The U.S. was not able to get all of those back, the unused ones, after this covert action program. And some of the weaponry got to people who would later become very much anti-U.S. This Soviet-Afghanistan topic reminds me of a time, and it was shortly after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. I was going through the papers of Senator Richard Russell in Georgia. You remember him from the CIA in Congress book. And I found a letter from a constituent to Senator Russell in about 1965 or 6, regretting U.S. Entry into a large-scale war in Vietnam. And Russell basically replied to the constituent, yes, I know, I agree with you. I urged President Johnson, before him President Kennedy, before him President Eisenhower, to avoid deeper involvement in Vietnam. But here's what Russell added that always stayed with me when I came across this letter in about 1990. It said, I regard Vietnam as the worst possible sort of landscape or environment in which to fight a war, with the possible exception of Afghanistan. So there you go, 2 more things on Reagan. See you soon.